He never ruled Belgium as a dictator. He never suspended its constitution. He rarely appeared on battlefields. And yet, under his personal authority, millions lived and died in a territory 76 times larger than his own country. How does a constitutional monarch construct an empire that operates as a private extraction machine? Why did European powers accept it? And where, inside this carefully engineered system, was the fracture that would eventually expose it? The answers are not found in rhetoric. They are found in structure. Power does not collapse overnight. It fractures along lines that were always there. This is architecture of tyranny. Today, Leopold II. Leopold II inherited a stable constitutional monarchy in 1865. Belgium was industrializing, commercially active, but geopolitically marginal. It lacked colonies. It lacked strategic depth. It lacked prestige. For a monarch in a parliamentary system, influence required another arena. The structural instability he identified was not domestic. It was international. The late 19th century was defined by imperial competition. Britain, France, Germany, and Portugal were expanding in Africa. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 85 formalized rules for territorial claims. Africa was not yet fully partitioned. That vacuum created opportunity. Leopold positioned himself not as a conqueror, but as a humanitarian patron of exploration. Through organizations such as the International African Association, he framed expansion as scientific and philanthropic. This framing mattered. European powers were not prepared to grant a small state like Belgium a vast colony, but they were willing to recognize a neutral sovereign pursuing civilization and free trade. At the Berlin Conference, the territory that would become the Congo Free State was recognized not as Belgian property, but as Leopold's personal possession. That legal distinction was foundational. The Congo was not an extension of the Belgian state. It was a private domain, and that difference would shape everything that followed. The first open question emerges here. How does a personal monarchy operate a territory thousands of miles away without formal national oversight? The answer lies in institutional design. Leopold did not need to dismantle Belgian institutions. He needed to bypass them. He constructed parallel structures. The Congo Free State operated under royal decrees issued directly by Leopold. There was no parliamentary supervision. Belgian courts had no jurisdiction. Administration was centralized in Brussels through a small, loyal inner circle. On the ground, authority was exercised by European agents and a military force known as the Force Publique. This force was not a conventional colonial army. It was a hybrid instrument. European officers commanding African soldiers, structured specifically for coercive extraction. The judiciary inside the Congo was subordinate to administrative authority. Legal process functioned as enforcement, not oversight. Economically, Leopold declared vast territories vacant land, placing them under state control. Indigenous systems of land tenure were nullified by decree. This allowed concession companies to extract rubber and ivory under monopolistic arrangements. The structure was vertically integrated, royal authority at the top, concession companies below, military enforcement beneath them, villages at the base. There was no independent press within the territory. Information flowed upward, but rarely outward. The system did not rely on Belgian democratic mechanisms. It relied on distance. Distance reduced scrutiny. Distance reduced accountability. Distance allowed experiment. But control over territory is not the same as control over behavior. The next phase required engineering compliance. The Congo Free State was not structured as a settlement colony. It was structured as an extraction grid. Rubber became the central commodity during the global bicycle and automobile boom. Production quotas were imposed on villages. Failure to meet quotas triggered punishment. The force publique operated through a system of hostages, enforced labor, and violent reprisal. This was not chaotic violence. It was administratively incentivized. Officers were evaluated based on output. Villages were assessed by quota. Ammunition usage was tracked to prevent waste. Fear was not incidental. It was procedural. Economically, local populations were denied market participation. Instead of wage labor in a free system, they were compelled into forced production for the state and concession companies. Dependency was engineered by eliminating alternatives. Infrastructure development, roads, river transport, was not designed for internal prosperity. It was designed for export flow. Surveillance operated through layered reporting systems. European agents submitted production data. African intermediaries monitored villages. Information moved upward in narrow channels. The system became self-reinforcing. More rubber generated more revenue. More revenue expanded enforcement capacity. Expanded enforcement increased quotas. But as with all centralized systems, success intensified structural strain. The more output required, the more coercion required. The question becomes, why did this model endure for 2 decades without immediate collapse? It worked because it aligned incentives. European elites benefited indirectly through concession profits and financial speculation. Belgian industry benefited from capital inflow. Domestic Belgian society did not experience repression. On the contrary, Leopold invested heavily in public architecture, monuments, museums, urban development in Brussels. The costs of the system were externalized. Citizens adapted because they were not participants in the coercive mechanism. International actors tolerated it for strategic reasons. Britain preferred a neutral buffer in Central Africa rather than French or German expansion. France calculated that recognition now could preserve influence later. Humanitarian rhetoric provided diplomatic cover, and the territory was remote. Reports of abuse were slow to circulate. Evidence was difficult to verify. Distance again functioned as insulation, but insulation is not permanence. Inside the structure, information was already narrowing. Revenue depended on a single commodity. Enforcement depended on escalating violence, and legitimacy depended on invisibility. When any of those variables shifted, the architecture would strain. The fracture was already embedded. The Congo Free State was over-centralized. Decision-making flowed from Leopold personally. Administrative authority lacked autonomous corrective capacity. This created rigidity. Economic distortion compounded the problem. Rubber extraction was prioritized over diversified development. Villages were stripped of labor capacity for subsistence agriculture. Long-term productivity declined. Elite rivalry also emerged. Concession companies pursued profit maximization, sometimes exceeding even Leopold's desired pace. Competition for revenue intensified brutality, increasing the probability of exposure. But the most critical fragility was informational. The system required secrecy, yet it also required documentation to maintain administrative control. Reports, photographs, missionary accounts, these began to circulate outside official channels. Once information escaped, the insulation of distance weakened. International humanitarian organizations began compiling evidence. Public opinion in Britain shifted. Parliamentary inquiries emerged. The architecture had no mechanism for transparent reform. Its legitimacy depended on denial. Denial is unstable when documentation accumulates. So the final question resolves: what event transformed structural weakness into irreversible exposure? The campaign, led by figures such as E.D. Morel and Roger Casement, did not create new abuses. It revealed existing ones. Casement's 1904 report systematically documented forced labor and mutilation practices. Photographic evidence circulated widely in Europe and North America. This altered the diplomatic calculus. Leopold could manage remote coercion. He could not easily manage coordinated international pressure. Belgium faced reputational risk. Foreign governments reconsidered recognition. The cost-benefit equation shifted. In 1908, under mounting pressure, the Belgian parliament annexed the Congo Free State, converting it into the Belgian Congo. Leopold relinquished personal control. The system did not collapse through internal revolt alone. It fractured when external scrutiny intersected with structural overextension. The insulation failed, and once the insulation failed, the architecture could not adapt quickly enough. Leopold II demonstrates a recurring structural pattern: identify geopolitical vacuum, frame expansion in acceptable ideological language, construct parallel institutions insulated from domestic accountability, align elite incentives with extraction, depend on distance to suppress scrutiny. The fragility emerges where over-centralization limits reform, economic monoculture distorts sustainability, information control depends on secrecy in an increasingly interconnected environment. Tyrannical systems do not fail because they are harsh. They fail when the mechanisms that once concealed strain begin to transmit it. Exposure converts structural weakness into structural liability, and once liability exceeds insulation, transfer of power becomes inevitable. Systems of power rarely fail by accident. They fail where they were weakest. If you want deeper analyses of how power is built and how it breaks, subscribe.